All right, stop that. We need to talk about the Young Turks. I want to talk about the Young Turks real quick. So here's a statement of undisputed fact. The Young Turks are murderers. Mass murderers. Genocidal murderers, actually. This is a fact. It's a matter of record. Their orders have led to the displacement and killings of well over 1 million people, and all done along ethnic and religious lines. So in other words, they're the very worst type of barbarian. They are scum, sir. And don't take my word for it. Here's a proper documentary off the telly, complete with a bona fide grey-haired historian saying as much.
The entire Armenian population was accused of these, quote, crimes.
They were going to be targeted for collective measures by the Ottoman state that would lead to the eradication of the Armenian population of Eastern Anatolia, and effectively the first modern genocide in history.
So in case you didn't know or haven't twigged, there are actually two The Young Turks. There's the 21st century news organ, anchored by Cenk, of course, Uygur, and Anna, I'm better than you, I'm way better than you, Kasparian. But then there's the original early 20th century Ottoman The Young Turks, whom Cenk named his organisation after in 2002. Now I'm going to talk all about the original The Young Turks, with reference to T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, that is, just to illustrate how vile they were and how, frankly, you've got to be out of your goddamn mind to call yourself after them. To call yourself the Young Turks in 2002, you've got to be out of your goddamn mind. It's like calling yourself the Young Waffen-SS or the Khmer Rouge Youth League or something. It's really quite astonishing.
Since 1913, the Ottoman government had been headed by an authoritarian nationalist triumvirate that had emerged from the Young Turk Revolution. Jamal Pasha, the Minister of the Navy. Talat Pasha, the Interior Minister. And Enver Pasha, the War Minister. On April the 24th, 1915, some 200 primarily Armenian intellectuals were arrested and murdered in Istanbul, an event that marks the beginning of the genocide. Armenians in Anatolia were deported to the Syrian desert, where they were murdered. The German military mission stood by without intervening. 2/3 of the Armenian population, more than 1 million people, were killed. The slaughter of the Armenians is evidence of the Ottoman Empire's national chauvinism. There was no room for Christians anymore. Its hardcore was Turkish and its margins exclusively Muslim.
So who were the Young Turks? The original Ottoman The Young Turks? Well, let's do a quick rundown of Ottoman history, just a few minutes of it, with some quotes from Seven Pillars of Wisdom. That's Lawrence of Arabia's memoir. If anyone knows a thing or two about the Young Turks, the Ottoman The Young Turks, it's Major Lawrence. Apart from being a superb linguist, an excellent intelligence officer in the end, and a bally hero, he's also quite a good writer. Okay, so the Ottoman Turks, originally the so-called Seljuk Turks, a Turkic people, came crashing down out of the Central Asian steppe in the 11th and 12th centuries. But in 1453, a key year in history, in 1453, these sons of Osman achieved one of their greatest victories, that is the sacking and occupying of Constantinople, or what is modern-day Istanbul. Because until then it had still been the so-called Byzantine Empire, which was a weird sort of ghost of the Eastern Roman Empire. It's complicated. But anyway, Mehmed II, Mehmed the Conqueror, finally puts the Byzantines out of business in 1453. And over the next few hundred years, these Ottomans go on to conquer a vast empire. It really is vast. In the west, they took practically all of North Africa, all of Greece and the Balkans, famously even pushing as far as Vienna a couple of times. Cheeky. And then to the east, all of modern Turkey, Anatolia, like Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Mesopotamia, which is modern Iraq, sort of basically, Palestine, or the Holy Land, whatever you want to call it, Egypt, and a big chunk of the Arabian Peninsula itself, all down the west-hand side there, the Hijaz. But this empire was never massively strong or knit together very well. It was more like a melting pot of lots of different peoples who, depending on which historian you want to listen to, harboured ancient animosities towards each other to varying degrees. Anyway, by the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was really the sick man of Europe. There are a gaggle of great empires in Europe at that point. You've got the British Empire, the French Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and even after Bismarck, you've got the German Empire. So compared to all of these, the Ottoman Empire was weak and fragile. So weak and fragile that the bigger boys on the block just started taking bits of it, and there was little that the Turks could do about it. In the 1850s, the Russians have a dig in Crimea. It takes the French and the British to stop them really overrunning that. And the Russians do it again in the late 1870s, actually. The Frogs take Algeria and Tunisia, and the Brits relieve them of control of Egypt. And even the Italians nick Libya off them. By the reign of the 34th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, a bloke called Abdul Hamid II, the last proper Sultan who ruled for himself. There were a couple after him, but he was the last proper Sultan, if you like. Most of the European parts of his empire were beginning to break away in nationalist movements. In the run-up to World War I, all places like Greece, Macedonia, Bulgaria, Serbia, Albania, Bosnia, the Bosniaks, they all wanted independence from the Ottoman yoke. They'd had enough. Here's a few paragraphs from T.E. Lawrence on that, and he uses the word Semite to mean Arab. Both Jewish and Arabic peoples are Semitic peoples. We don't use it much these days to mean Arabic people, but it's an old-fashioned book he wrote in the early 20s. So he means Arabs, not Jews, when he talks about Semites. It's a tiny bit confusing to us, but there it is. Quote, "The first great rush around the Mediterranean had shown the world the power of an excited Arab for a short spell of intense physical activity. But when the effort burned out, the lack of endurance and routine in the Semitic mind became as evident. The provinces they had overrun they neglected out of sheer distaste of system, and had to seek the help of their conquered subjects or of more vigorous foreigners to administer their ill-knit and incoherent empires. So, early in the Middle Ages, the Turks found a footing in the Arab states, first as servants, then as helpers, and then as a parasite growth which choked the life out of the old body politic. The last phase was of enmity, when the Hulagus and Timurs sated their bloodlust, burning and destroying everything which irked them with a pretension of superiority. By stages the Semites of Asia passed under their yoke, and found it a slow death. Their goods were stripped from them, and their spirits shrivelled in the numbing breath of a military government. Turkish rule was gendarme rule, and Turkish political theory as crude as its practice. The Turks taught the Arabs that the interests of a sect were higher than those of patriotism, that the petty concerns of the province were more than nationality. They led them by subtle dissensions to distrust one another. Even the Arabic language was banished from courts and offices, from the government services, and from superior schools. Arabs might only serve the state by sacrifice of their racial characteristics. These measures were not accepted quietly. Semitic tenacity showed itself in the many rebellions of Syria, Mesopotamia and Arabia against the grosser forms of Turkish penetration, and resistance was also made to the more insidious attempts at absorption. The Arabs would not give up their rich and flexible tongue for crude Turkish. Instead, they filled Turkish with Arabic words and held to the treasures of their own literature. Then came the Turkish Revolution, the fall of Abdul Hamid and the supremacy of the Young Turks. The horizon momentarily broadened for the Arabs. The Young Turk movement was a revolt against the hierarchic conception of Islam and the pan-Islamic theories of the old Sultan, who had aspired, by making himself spiritual director of the Muslim world, to be also, beyond appeal, its director in temporal affairs. These young politicians rebelled and threw him into prison under the impulse of constitutional theories of a sovereign state. So, at a time when Western Europe was just beginning to climb out of nationality into internationality and to rumble with wars far removed from problems of race, Western Asia began to climb out of Catholicism into nationalist politics and to dream of wars for self-government and self-sovereignty instead of for faith or dogma. This tendency had broken out first and most strongly in the Near East, in the little Balkan states. and had sustained them through an almost unparalleled martyrdom to their goal of separation from Turkey. Later there had been nationalist movements in Egypt, in India, in Persia, and finally in Constantinople. There they were fortified and made pointed by the new American ideas in education, ideas which, when released in the old high Oriental atmosphere, made an explosive mixture. The American schools, teaching by the method of inquiry, encouraged scientific detachment and free exchange of views. Quite without intention they taught revolution, since it was impossible for an individual to be modern in Turkey and at the same time loyal, if he had been born to one of the subject races, Greeks, Arabs, Kurds, Armenians or Albanians, over whom the Turks were so long helped to keep dominion. The Young Turks, in the confidence of their first success, were carried away by the logic of their principles, and as protest against pan-Islam, preached Ottoman brotherhood. The gullible subject races, far more numerous than the Turks themselves, believed that they were called upon to cooperate in building a new East. Rushing to the task, full of Herbert Spencer and Alexander Hamilton, they laid down platforms of sweeping ideas and hailed the Turks as partners. The Turks, terrified at the forces they had let loose, drew the fires as suddenly as they had stoked them. Turkey made Turkish for the Turks. Yeni Turan became the cry. Later on, the policy would turn them towards the rescue of their irredenti, the Turkish populations subject to Russia in Central Asia. But, first of all, they must purge their empire of such irritating subject races as resisted the ruling strap. The Arabs, the largest alien component of Turkey, must first be dealt with. Accordingly, the Arab deputies were scattered, the Arab societies forbidden, the Arab notables proscribed. Arabic manifestations and the Arabic language were suppressed by Enver Pasha, more sternly than by Abdul Hamid before him." End quote.
On the 3rd of July 1908, a group of young officers mutinied in Thessaloniki. Like all the Ottoman troops, they were Muslim. They were members of the Committee of Union and Progress, the largest opposition to the Sultan. They proclaimed their Turkish identity. Humiliated by the defeats and the successive retreat of the empire, they wanted to put an end to Abdul Hamid's authoritarian regime and save the empire. Calling themselves the Young Turks. Within 3 weeks, they'd set the Balkans on fire. The Sultan was under pressure to act. On the 23rd of July, Abdul Hamid had to reinstate the liberal constitution of 1876, which he had set aside in 1878. The mood was euphoric, a hitherto unknown feeling of freedom and fraternity. In a famous speech, Enver Pasha, one of the revolutionary leaders, said, "We're all brothers. There are no Bulgarians, Greeks, Serbs, Romanians or Jews in our empire. We're proud to be Ottomans."
The paradoxical aspect of this Young Turk movement was that it emerged to save the Ottoman Empire, but in reality it gave all those rebellious forces in the empire more of a voice. The Young Turks quickly recognized this paradox. And that's why they initially said, "We're going to preserve the Ottoman Empire and will respect the demands of the non-Muslims. But the Turkish element has to be dominant in the empire." The patriotic Young Turks gradually became nationalist Turks.
The nationalist wave that had been triggered a century earlier in Greece had finally arrived in the hard Turkish core of the Ottoman Empire. It was close to the end.
It's in 1908 that this Abdul Hamid finally loses complete autocratic control over his empire and government, and is basically forced to allow a civilian government, along with, of course, any factions or cliques that inevitably come along with that. And this is where finally we come to the Young Turks. The Young Turks were the name given to the group of guys that seized control of the state and instituted a number of highly questionable policies, shall we say, all of which led directly to the final collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Right, so the Young Turks knew that they were in a tough spot. They knew they were dealing with this once magnificent empire that was now crumbling to dust beneath their feet. They figured they'd take some sort of radical steps to stop the rot, basically promoting Turkish nationalism and stomping out dissent from their subject peoples, up to and including massacres and mass displacements and all sorts of horrors, and not restricted to just the Armenian genocide of 1915 either. And it's not like we don't know who the Young Turks were. They weren't some faceless, nameless bureaucrats deep in the heart of some labyrinthine sultan's palace in Constantinople. We know all about them. And these guys were like Ottoman fundamentalists, basically, willing to stop at almost nothing to achieve their ends. Filth. The Young Turks faction were bent on trying to keep what remained of the Ottoman Empire together at all costs. They ultimately failed, lost World War I, and ended up with just Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey, plus a few trimmings around the edges, headed by a secular government of Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal. So a complete and utter failure of the Young Turk project, basically. The leaders of the Young Turks ingloriously had to flee for their lives, in the end. Pathetic.
The three pashas, Talat, Enver and Jamal, who had taken the empire into war, fled on board a German submarine 2 days later. The Ottoman Empire was in ruins.
But I think it's all too easy to just mention massacres and genocides and unspeakably large numbers of murders without actually engaging in what that means, what that looks like. So in order to lend a bit of technicolor to the crimes of the Young Turks, I want to read a passage from T. Lawrence's memoir. It's a bit where he and a small number of British and French troops, along with an entire Bedouin Arab army, are chasing the Ottomans, along with a small number of Germans, back to Turkey itself. It's at the very end of World War I. They've chased them all the way from the heart of Arabia over many years. And finally, the Turks, the Ottomans, are in full retreat. In this passage, he mentions some of his companions with names like Auda and Talal, but don't worry too much about who they are, just go with it. Writer and novelist Michael Korda calls this bit one of the most, quote, extraordinary and gruelling passages in Seven Pillars of Wisdom, and certainly the description of Tafas justifies placing Lawrence among the great writers about war, end quote. Oh, and this bit takes place just as they advance into a small Syrian village called Tafas, just after the Ottoman troops had left, the troops under the command of the Young Turks. This is the sort of misery the Young Turks left in their wake. Quote, "The Arabs told us that the Turkish column, Jamal Pasha's Lancer regiment, were already entering Tafas. When we got within sight, we found they had taken the village, from which sounded an occasional shot, and were halted about it. Small pyres of smoke were going up from between the houses. On the rising ground to this side, knee-deep in the thistles, stood a remnant of old men, women and children, telling terrible stories of what had happened when the Turks rushed in an hour before. We lay on watch, and saw the enemy force march away from their assembly ground behind the houses. They headed in good order towards Miskin. The lancers in front and rear, composite formations of infantry disposed in column with machine gun support as flank guards, guns and a mass of transport in the centre. We opened fire on the head of their line when it showed itself beyond the houses. They turned 2 field guns upon us for reply. The shrapnel was as usual overfused and passed safely over our heads. Nuri came with Pisani. Before their ranks rode Auda Abu Ta'i, expectant, and Talal, nearly frantic with the tales his people poured out of the sufferings of the village. The last Turks were now quitting it. We slipped down behind them to end Talal's suspense, while our infantry took position and fired strongly with the Hotchkiss. Pisani advanced his half-battery among them, so that the French high explosive threw the rearguard into confusion. The village lay stilly under its slow wreaths of white smoke as we rode near on our guard. Some grey heaps seemed to hide in the low grass, embracing the ground in the close way of corpses. We looked away from these, knowing they were dead. But from one a little figure tottered off, as if to escape us. It was a child, 3 or 4 years old, whose dirty smock was stained red over one shoulder and side, with blood from a large, half-fibrous wound, perhaps a lance thrust, just where the neck and body joined. The child ran a few steps, then stood and cried to us in a tone of astonishing strength, all else being very silent. "Don't hit me, Baba!" Abdul el-Aziz, choking out something, this was his village and she might be of his family, flung himself off his camel and stumbled, kneeling in the grass beside the child. His suddenness frightened her, for she threw up her arms and tried to scream, but instead dropped in a little heap, while the blood rushed out again over her clothes. Then, I think, she died. We rode past the other bodies of men and women and 4 more dead babies, looking very soiled in the daylight towards the village, whose loneliness we now knew meant death and horror. By the outskirts were low mud walls, sheepfolds, and on one something red and white. I looked close and saw the body of a woman folded across it, bottom upwards, nailed there by a saw bayonet, whose haft stuck hideously into the air from between her naked legs. She had been pregnant, and about her lay others, perhaps 20 in all, variously killed, but set out in accord with an obscene taste. Zagi burst into wild peals of laughter, the more desolate for the warm sunshine and clear air in this upland afternoon. I said, "The best of you brings me the most Turkish dead," and we turned after the fading enemy, on our way shooting down those who had fallen out by the roadside and came imploring our pity. One wounded Turk, half naked, not able to stand, sat and wept at us. Abdullah turned away his camel's head, but Zagi, with curses, crossed his track and whipped 3 bullets from his automatic through the man's bare chest. The blood came out with his heartbeats, throb, 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 slower and slower. Talal had seen what we had seen. He gave one moan like a hurt animal, then rode to the upper ground and sat there a while on his mare, shivering and looking fixedly after the Turks. I moved near to speak to him, but Auda caught my rein and stayed me. Very slowly Talal drew his headcloth about his face, and then he seemed suddenly to take hold of himself, for he dashed his stirrups into his mare's flanks and galloped headlong, bending low and swaying in the saddle, right at the main body of the enemy. It was a long ride down a gentle slope and across a hollow. We sat there like stone, while he rushed forward, the drumming of his hoofs unnaturally loud in our ears, for we had stopped shooting, and the Turks had stopped. Both armies waited for him, and he rocked on in the hushed evening till only a few lengths from the enemy. Then he sat up in the saddle and cried his war cry, "Talal! Talal!" twice in a tremendous shout. Instantly their rifles and machine guns crashed out, and he and his mare, riddled through and through with bullets, fell dead among the lance points. End quote. So that's what Jamal Pasha's men did. That's what the Young Turks did. Shit like that. They were irredeemable butchers. And to call yourself after them in the 21st century must be the product of a sick and or terribly uninformed mind.